Taoiseach, in December 2017, I raised with you the case of Anthony Cole, the first Lariam action which had just been settled after the state sparing no expense assembling a major legal team over 10 days of hearings over 5 months before you threw in the towel. The second Lariam case, Patrick Fettigan's, was settled 2 weeks ago. Again on the steps of the court, again after enormous cost, again after enormous delay. And I'm wondering what on earth is going on here. Not only are you not dealing with the existing cases of Defence Forces personnel who've experienced devastating health consequences as a result of taking Lariam, but you're actually potentially adding to their numbers by continuing to force soldiers to take Lariam despite their wishes and despite a motion passed by this House. And now, as a result of that, we have almost 300 loyal but damaged men and women who serve this state proudly, whose papers have been lodged with the courts, facing a lengthy, costly litigation process before you'll eventually have to settle, and have to settle ye will. And there's not a word about redress or compensation to end this madness. It's a crazy situation. Of course, when they get to the courts, they're likely to meet the 83 pandemics cases which have been lodged before the courts as a result of the mainly children who developed narcolepsy after receiving the swine flu vaccine. Suffering families who've had to fight this state for discovery for years. And when I raised this with the Taoiseach last year, he said he was instructing the Minister for Health to bring forward the programme for government commitment to introduce a no-fault vaccine scheme to respond to the needs of people with disability arising from vaccination, and that it would be implemented by last year. Where is it? The programme for government is 3 years old. This scheme was recommended back as early as 2001. These families are suffering since 2010. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the state is engaged in some clandestine plot to enrich the legal profession at the expense of the public and to the detriment of those whose health has been seriously negatively impacted upon as a result of state actions. For them, there's no justice and no accountability. And I think it's absolutely appalling. And while everybody moved on to the latest scandal a couple of weeks ago, I don't know, was it John Delaney or whoever it was, the flavour of the month in the last 2 weeks, Scally produced his latest report where he outlined the problems with the open disclosure, which, as he said, despite being judged to be deeply flawed, remains in place. Now, Taoiseach, this is not good enough for you to say, oh, we're working on it. You've been foostering around with these issues for more than 11 years. We had actually succeeded in having mandatory open disclosure before your government removed it 2 years ago. So my question is, when are you going to stop talking about doing things and actually start doing them? I was going to say talk is cheap, but it's not cheap for the victims and it's not cheap for the state, and it's about time you started delivering on some of these things that you tell us that you're dealing with.
Thanks, Deputy. There was a lot of questions there. Let me just deal with the Lariam issue first. And I think it is important to emphasise that malaria is a very serious disease that's killed hundreds of thousands of people, and we need to protect our troops when they are in malaria zones in different parts of the world. But let me be very clear to the House that the health and welfare of the men and women of the Defence Forces is the utmost priority for both the government and military authorities. I am advised that there are 3 anti-malaria drugs, and I remember when I was in the Ministry for Defence, looking at this issue and indeed speaking to many of the families that have concerns in relation to the use of Lariam in the past. The choice of medication for overseas deployment for both officers and enlisted personnel, including the use of Lariam and other drugs, is a medical decision made by medical officers in the Defence Forces, having regard to the specific circumstances of the mission and the individual member of the Defence Forces. In other words, depending on how long they're going to be in the region and what is the medical advice in terms of the appropriate use of drug as regards the frequency that's required to take those drugs and so on. A working group reviewed the Defence Forces' approach in relation to these drugs and to ensure that the procedures in relation to this continue to be appropriate and in accordance with international best practice. And I remember reading a number of reports in other countries in relation to the use of Lariam or indeed other drugs. A further case has been listed for hearing in the High Court on the 7th of May. Given that litigation is pending, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on individual cases. But, Deputy, this has been an ongoing debate for many years now. I and other ministers have been confronted by it. And the approach that the current minister takes and the government takes is to try to ensure that we are acting on the best advice of doctors and medical personnel in the Defence Forces and indeed outside of it in relation to working groups, so that we protect the health of our soldiers. And that is the only motivation in relation to any policy towards the use of Lariam or indeed other drugs that are there to combat the dangers of malaria.
A lot of time for you, but I have to say I'm very disappointed in your response, and your response is indicative of why we're in the mess that we are in, because what you've given me is civil service speak. The working group on Lariam actually recommended that a medical advisory group would be set up to look into these issues. That was in 2017. Under an FOI I got recently, do you know how many times they've met? None. Not one. And best medical practice would tell you that other defence forces are not using Lariam. So your answer is patently wrong. You didn't deal with all the fundamental questions that I put to you, which is because of the state's denial, their continuing to over-reliance on litigation, and their failure to address the serious concerns of people whose health has been impacted by state actions. You're costing those people enormous hardship, you're enriching the legal profession, and you're not making our health service safe. And the type of answer you've given me is the same one that is the reason why we haven't got an open disclosure, mandatory open disclosure policy which would make our hospitals safer, because you're just listening to civil servants, you're not listening to your instincts, and you're not addressing the issues that you say you'll address. And frankly, I think it's incredibly disappointing, and citizens deserve a lot more.
Well, Deputy, in relation to open disclosure, we're introducing a patient safety bill that will require that. So, well, it's being brought through the system. The government has committed to that patient safety bill, and we will fully follow through on it. But on the broader issue of the approach to Lariam, Deputy, we've spoken about this before, and you know it. This is not a straightforward issue to deal with. Families have made certain accusations, and they need to be tested. They have chosen a legal route to look for compensation and the truth, and they're perfectly entitled to do that. And the state has a perspective on this too. But I mean, the core issue here is whether or not Lariam is still suitable for use. Different countries take different approaches. To make the case that all countries are moving away from the use of Lariam simply isn't true. Some countries have, others haven't. Others use it in certain circumstances and in certain locations, others don't. And I mean, I haven't been involved in this file for a while because I'm outside of that department. And I'll follow up in relation to the medical experts group, and in fact I'll come back to you directly on that. But on the broader issue, it's not as simple an issue to deal with as sometimes you maintain.